Dan, I'm very happy to have you as a guest on the Supply Chain College podcast.
Vielen Dank, dass ich in Ihrem Podcast dabei sein durfte. Now,
Well,
Martin, you said
very
you have some
nice.
surprises for me, but that was the one, that was the limit of my preparation for this. And I insist, despite my excellent German, that we do the rest of the podcast in English, okay?
Perfect. Absolutely. We will do it in English. And but before we kick off with the topic which we prepared for today, maybe it's really about you as the guest, because I'm very happy to have guests like you with a certain expertise and personality also here on the Supply Chain College. Can you explain the viewers, the listeners, a bit about yourself, who you are, where you live, where you are located today, from like which location do you record the podcast with me,
Yeah.
and so on. That would be very nice.
Yeah, absolutely. First, Martin, seriously, thank you for having me. I know we've been circulating in each other's orbit on LinkedIn for a long time, and we met in person. It was almost a year ago, I think, at Bram de Smet's book launch. And I remember you were a speaker, and you really brought terrific energy to the room. So it's very nice to be talking to you today. I'm American, if you couldn't tell. That's maybe not a so popular thing to say these days, but usually when I have working sessions or Zoom or team sessions with European colleagues, they know I'm American before I even open my mouth, because only an American would boast all of these diplomas and things behind him. And that's when I tell them that that they're actually my wife's diplomas, so I can't claim the credit. But yeah, I'm in the U.S. I'm recording from St. Louis, Missouri. That's in the middle of the country, for those that don't know. So you have always know New York and Los Angeles, but this is maybe 5 hours by car south of Chicago. It's still a large city with a diverse industry, but maybe not well known to international audience. And yeah, unless you have a conference here or something, you probably don't have a reason to go. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, like, if you look behind myself, I also have some diplomas, but it's also this just a reminder the hassle I gone through because I did all my studies next to the job, because I started very young. So I was studying the first 10 to 12 years whilst working, actually.
Okay.
And that's why I just keep them, because I'm proud of them. And also it's just a reminder of where I come from and the good combination of theory and practice.
Was it? I know a little bit, but this could be completely wrong. But was it a duale Hochschule program that you did?
No, not directly. It goes in that direction, but in Germany we are very lucky, let's say, that we have a very strong on the job, let's say, education system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have this very strong apprenticeship program
Okay.
where you have like 3 years after school, you can learn like practically a job, also like in administration, not only as a craftsman or so. And then you can continue. You can make your, what is the English? It's like a master in this and that.
Okay.
And then you can make kind of a bachelor's degree. Sorry, now when I said master, it's not like an MBA. That's then what really at the end. It's more like an expert in this and that, and then maybe the
Okay.
bachelor is the next one. And then actually I did in the UK my Master of Business Administration. So I was really doing a lot of things next to the job, because I'm not sure if you have that in the US. We have something called Abitur, which is like that's the highest school education you can do before you learn something or go studying. But I didn't do that, so I jumped out after 10 classes. So that's why I needed to go the long way around, because I didn't finish this highest degree
I
first.
will pretend that I understand, but I'm always amazed at how different the education systems are across different countries.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's just ingrained in us, but in the US it's very linear for most of it. I mean, you're going through kindergarten, okay, we'll use a German word there, all the way through our 12th grade. That's what we call high school. And then you of course have the option to go on to
Mhm.
university or college, as we would more commonly call it. And the first thing you're going to do is probably a 4-year bachelor's degree.
Mhm.
And then if you want to extend your education beyond that, there are master's degrees, MBA being one of them you already referenced. And then, of course, some people go on to attain a PhD. But
Mhm.
it seems fairly linear, with not so many branches and decisions that you can make as in other countries.
Yeah.
And, and
And
Martin, yeah, go ahead.
no, yeah, I just wanted to ask a bit also, like, what's your background, right? Because you explain a bit where you are, where you live. Um, uh,
I don't want to put your listeners to sleep or anything like that, but I think it's interesting, actually, since we already talk about education and career paths just a little bit. But I think somebody remarked a while ago, looking at my career now and looking backwards, they see some highlights and they say, "Oh, wow, you really designed your career. You knew exactly what you wanted to do." But the reality is, it could not have been more circuitous. And for me, it wasn't designed, but I always just chased my passions and kind of kept my options open. But yeah, if I go chronologically and hit the high notes, first of all, my undergraduate degree is geography and meteorology.
Oh,
So
wow.
nothing to do with supply chain. And I found myself working at Garmin. So I think this is a household name. They were the pioneer in the GPS world. They do a lot of consumer electronics, now expanded into smartwatches. They're in aviation, marine, other things like that. And I was actually in their cartography software division because my background was geography, geographic information systems. And it was a very cool job. We were using very interesting tools. We were on the cutting edge of things. But even within maybe 1 year of doing that job, I was curious, like, what happens outside the walls of my cubicle? And they had this opportunity. It's called an internal audit team. It's voluntary. And I said, yeah, I'm curious to do this and use my extra time to learn about other departments. So we would get an assignment every month and we would go to the legal team. We would go to the purchasing team. We would go to the R&D department, and we were auditing internal procedures, but also it's a avionics company, so aviation electronics. And so there were federal aviation regulations that we had to check and things like that. But it got me exposure to a lot of different departments within the company. And the ones that I fell in love with were manufacturing and warehousing. And so I just have to think back, like, supply chain was not a thing when I went to school in the early 2000s. You maybe could do industrial engineering. That was going to be maybe the closest thing. So in any case, I fell in love with the supply chain at Garmin. And at some point, about 4 years into my career, an opportunity opened up for me to move into that department. It was actually called operations. And there I was a global supply chain analyst. And we were doing process improvement on sales and operations planning, but also on logistics and distribution aspects as well. The company was growing quite fast at that time. And yeah, again, I fell into my passion. So my career really accelerated there because I was doing things that I really enjoyed. At the same time, like you were describing, I also earned my master's in business administration in parallel with my work at that time. And so I was already able to start to take the things that I was learning on the job and connect it to finance and things like that. And yeah, I had several roles at Garmin. I was there for 12 years. And one of the things that I enjoyed the most was supply chain network design. We did not have any fancy tools. We were using Excel, Access databases, things like that. But what I really liked was connecting the supply chain to the financial component. And also, they weren't small problems like, yeah, let's move this machine within this factory. It was really pulling what I would call these big levers. Okay, are we going to open a distribution center? Are we going to expand our footprint into this geography? So this was by far my favorite part of the job, but it was probably 15 to 20% of the job. And I knew that I wanted to do more of this. And I actually had an aspiration to be a consultant. My family, they're mostly in consulting background as well. So this is kind of how I envisioned my career. And this is when I found this company, LlamaSoft. Maybe not a household name, but some of your listeners might recognize it. They've since been acquired by Coupa. But they were one of the early companies that was doing supply chain network optimization software. So I joined LlamaSoft. I was there for 7 years. I was a consultant in the field, helping their customers do supply chain network analytics, right? So where are we going to open factories? How are we going to allocate across our different distribution centers? What should our safety stock be? How should we route our vehicles? All of these types of questions, they require knowledge of the business, but also knowledge of analytics. And yeah, again, the career unfolds in unpredictable ways. At some point during the 7 years I was at LlamaSoft, somebody said, we really want to start an education services function. And I had already been doing quite a bit of training for our customers. So I sort of found myself drifting into the education part. And there we also started an academic program. So I found myself giving guest lectures at universities.
Mhm.
And one of those opportunities blossomed into joining the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis. So I've got the pennant here.
Mhm.
Yeah, at some point, I left Lamasoft, which was now acquired by Coupa, and I started heavier into teaching and also into consulting. And you've had Bram de Smet on your podcast before. We mentioned that we met at his book launch.
Mhm.
And actually, I had read his books, and this is where I prove that it's not a fake background back here for those that are watching. But I have his books, and you can see that they're marked up.
Yeah.
So actually, somewhere along this journey, I had read Bram's first book, and it was the only book he had at that time. And I said, "Yeah, this guy, he gets it, right?" And I said, "To hell with the way that I'm teaching this. I want to teach it the way that he's teaching it." And I reached out to him on LinkedIn and I said, how can we work together? So Bram, for those of your listeners who don't know, he's a professor at Vlerick University. He and I started this initiative called the Strategy Driven Supply Chain Institute. And then he's also CEO of a company called Solventure that is a consultancy mostly for sales and operations planning implementations. And so Bram and I work together on a couple of things. And then on top of that, I've got my teaching at the university. That was a very long-winded
Excellent.
way, but I guess
But it's
if there's a takeaway, Martin, I would say to your listeners, if they're early in their career, but even later in their career, as I reflect on that, I would say don't design a career path with a destination in mind. Okay, it's a nice to have a target and have something concrete that you're aiming at, but I would say instead of designing a career path, design a career process that leaves you open to exploring opportunities because you never know what's going to unfold. That's
Yeah,
my only
absolutely.
takeaway.
No, I really like that, and I think in a second we dive a bit into the topic, and so it's very good that you took a bit of time to explain where you come from, because that makes you perfect fit to talk about the topic we will talk about, the network modeling and supply chain design. But what I also, when I look to my left, you will not see it on the camera. There is also a bookshelf next to the small selection behind me. And there's also a book, Serendipity, I think is the English version. And it's in German, Erfolgsprinzip Zufall. And also that explains, so in hindsight, everything looks logic, like fully planned, but it was like,
Yeah.
it is in the end, it's not like that. And what I liked a lot when you explained or talked about or shared insights from your past, it looks like you followed your passion. So you like the analytics. You went to Lamasofts to do more about analytics. Then you went into education and consulting. For me, at least in my simple mind, is very closely linked,
Yes.
because in order to consult somebody, a firm or whatever, a team, you also educate them about the concepts, the tools, the whatever. Yeah. So there is a kind of a logic, let's say.
Martin, it's really interesting
in
what
it.
you say about the education connecting to consulting, because when I look at consulting, certainly there's going to be consultants that you bring in that are, we think of consulting as experts, right? And when we think about experts, we think of experts in a specific domain. But now I think we need to look at that along different dimensions because, okay, even at Lamasoft, I'm not going to be an expert in consumer packaged goods and also an expert in natural resources and mining and an expert in high-tech electronics. Like it's not
Mhm.
probably not practical to be an expert deep in all of those things, but you can be an expert in the methodologies and the frameworks and the types of analytics used and apply those analytics to the types of problems too. So
Yeah.
it's always more like a facilitative consulting rather than hey, I'm coming in with some specific expertise that says you should definitely put your distribution center here and your factory here and you should only make this type of good here. It's I don't have that expertise. I'm sure some people do,
Mhm.
but yeah, it's more about the methodology and the framework. So
Yeah.
very closely linked to education.
Excellent. And I think we already broke the ice, but still, I would love to. It's
Sure.
very short answers. You don't need to.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can make it long if you want. We have time. But I have these icebreakers, supply chain icebreakers, and there are two categories I selected for you. And one is the insights category, so learning something about you. Like if you would be now in a whatever in a workshop or so, that could be a question. It's in German, but I will speak it out in English or read it out in English. What has been your proudest moment, work related, obviously in the last 12 months?
Ooh, okay. In the last 12 months, we actually already touched on this a little bit, but seriously, being a presenter at that book launch, this is by far was a very nice achievement for me. I've worked side by side with Bram for several years now. We even ahead of him writing the book, it's his book, but we facilitated a book council where we had some sparring sessions with supply chain leaders. So to see that come to fruition and share in his achievement in some small sense, that was really nice for me. Also, just to say, you're looking at the last 12 months, but I'm excited, and I'll have to come back at some point to the show, because in a few months I have an article being released in a supply chain magazine, and to me this will be a nice achievement too, because it's maybe my first independent invention that popped out of my head. So I'm proud of having something published there.
Oh, very nice. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And the last question before we go into the real topic of the podcast. Let's imagine you're working in an organization, like in your Garmin times, for instance. That was maybe the closest one which comes in my mind. And you need to talk to your sales and marketing colleagues, and you need to teach them something about supply chain, and especially something which they should never forget anymore, and they need to really keep. What would that be? What would be the topic or the
I have to
lesson?
pick just one thing here, right?
It's up to you.
Well, I think that the thing is that maybe it's not something so tactical, but more philosophical, is that we are reliant on their input. So of course, in supply chain, we like to smash sales and marketing around and say, you're not really helping us. But actually, we're dependent on their insights, right? No single person inside the organization is going to have the complete picture of demand. Yes, we can have external market indicators that tell us the macro economy, what that's doing. But the sales team, the marketing team, they're aware of things that are happening at the organization level, at the brand level, at the local account level. And these inputs are absolutely vital to having a solid supply chain plan.
Very good. Thank you, Dan. And then, yeah, going into the topic, and maybe we need to define first and how you define actually the term. I called it supply chain network modeling, supply chain simulations, supply chain design. You can pick a different name for it, but how would you actually frame it before we go into more details there?
Yeah. Maybe a few dimensions to it. First of all, I like supply chain design or supply chain network design. If we start to throw in terms like optimization and simulation, those start to speak more towards specific technologies. So if we want to keep it above that until we figure out what technologies, I would just call it supply chain network design. And actually, you ask a very good question. I think the way that it's defined is probably best done by the types of use cases it applies to. And when I start to think about the use cases, I think it actually is a pretty broad spectrum, right? We have things that are very strategic in nature, and I've already alluded to a few of them, but if you are expanding into a new geography and you have to open a new distribution center, or you're making an acquisition, these are almost like blue sky type problems, very strategic, clean sheet. We call them sometimes greenfield in supply chain. So very strategic level. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we might have decisions that are being made multiple times per month or week at multiple sites, but they would still benefit from some type of design. And so I think about things like vehicle routing, right? We might have 15, 20 distribution centers that all have certain fleets of trucks associated with them, but we want to design the routes for them. And maybe it's changing week over week, depending on customer churn and things like that as well. So they're multi-local and multi-temporal, but still happening on a totally different scale than the strategic. And then I would say that there's everything in between as well. So again, maybe annually I look at my customers or supplier base, and I see that there have been some changes, so I need to reallocate
Hmm.
customers to different distribution centers or reallocate suppliers to different factories. These are things that don't require massive capital investments. It's more of a policy type change where I'm just
Hmm.
saying now this guy will source this guy and we'll go from A to B instead of A to Z. So we have strategic, tactical, and operational, but
Hmm.
really supply chain network design can benefit all three of those scales.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Your explanation. Also, I think the strategic is very clear. But yeah, and like I love the blue sky analogy, but also I'm more used to calling it greenfield,
Yeah,
or and then we say brownfield
yeah,
for maybe
sure.
whatever, not being able to change everything in a more mature, let's say,
Absolutely.
corporation. But also, like I'm a planner by heart. As a supply chain professional, I'm more like I count myself into the planner camp. And there, I'm also thinking what the multi-sourcing scenarios. Let's say we have multiple suppliers, multiple maybe own in-house production sites, where we can, on a tactical horizon, based on certain rules, based on the demand or whatever, actually reallocate volumes to different factories, different production lines, whatever. Sometimes also I think we forget to put it actually under the network supply chain design
I think
because
it's a gray
it's
area, Martin.
yeah.
I think this is an area that is not defined, and also, do we always need to put a label on it either? I mean, if you really look under the hood of a lot of APS, advanced planning systems, okay, they're using linear programs the same
Mhm.
way we would use in supply chain design. Maybe the algorithms for choosing optimal sources are very similar to the structure that we would be putting into a network design
Mhm.
model. It might even be identical in some cases. It's really just the time horizon and the scale of the problem that you're looking at. So yeah, I think the boundary for supply chain design is quite fuzzy, and
Mhm.
I've made my peace with that.
You defined like classical as strategic, tactical, operational, let's say, time horizons. I'm also thinking a bit about, let's say, complexity or scope,
Hmm.
because like you can do, and we come maybe to some examples. We can do big footprint analysis, but also we can just analyze certain flows, like a small scope of a certain supply chain, to optimize the flow of goods, right? To whatever, drive less kilometers or miles in your case, and save on the CO2 footprint, whatever. And ultimately have a cost saving because it's sometimes the most easy then to sell these changes into the organization. So there can be kind of this ad hoc mini projects and then the super big multi-year or even decades long
Hmm.
projects, depending on what you want to do. Do you agree to that, or do you always say you always need to have the big picture before you can do the small stuff?
Yeah, I mean, in reality, I think everybody wants to go to this utopia, which is, we'll call it digital twin. Maybe we come to this topic later as well,
Yes.
but for now, we would call it a digital twin. And in people's utopia, the digital twin is everything. So it's very, very broad. It covers every aspect of supply chain, maybe even some things we would not necessarily typically consider supply chain. And it's also ultra high fidelity, right? Very, very detailed, down to the SKU level, individual resources, and things like that. And I
Mhm.
think this is a nice utopia, and we can always strive for this. But I don't think it's practical for a number of reasons. One, just the complexity, and I don't mean just computational complexity. That's going to be a problem with this as well. But the complexity of trying to get your arms around all of the data that's required to do that type of modeling. So I think what we typically see instead of this one massive master model for an entire organization is a lot of smaller models that either
Mhm.
make up a specific geographic scope, a specific business unit scope, maybe a specific project or event, like, hey, we need to figure out what to do about tariffs in this particular region, or some acquisition, something like that. And based on the type of problem that we're wanting to solve, we abstract the necessary elements
Mhm.
specific to that problem. It's
Yeah.
always nice to have a nice foundation of data. Yeah, I know my sites, I know my products. I can keep a living model of those things, but a lot of other stuff is changing all of the time, and it's not so practical to keep it up to date in between modeling projects.
Yeah. Yeah. Because now we need to be careful not to jump too much around. But I'm just so certain you triggered certain things in my mind, and one thing is still on a super high level. When I think about this footprint, or like, let's say more strategic design, let's call it projects. What is more important, like to have maybe a very, very sophisticated change and project management in place? Or is the tool, the analysis, the analytics, the capabilities, let's say, of the analysts and so on, and of the tool, is that the most important part to look out? Because for me, that goes really hand in hand, because when I stumbled across it in all my career, wherever I worked, there was always something in this kind of network, whatever projects and so on. That was often really multi-year long mega projects. And I'm still asking myself today, looking back, which projects I like the most or have been the most successful also? Is it the ones with the best project management approach, or the teams with the best capabilities on the analytics sides? Do you have an opinion on that?
I think if we look at this as broader than just an analytics project and a transformation project, the analytics are a small portion. So let's just take adding a new distribution center. This is a multi-million-dollar project when we think about everything from start to finish with making the distribution center go live. And the analytics are on the front end of this. It's either deciding where you want to put the distribution center, or even sometimes validating a hypothesis that already exists within the organization. And if we're talking about a multi-million-dollar project, it's going to open up markets worth of millions or billions of dollars. The analytics is a couple of $100,000 on top of it. So we don't want to give all of the credit for the ROI or return on investment to the analytics, but it's an important part of the project. Now, I think it will depend, and this is why I can't give a categorical answer to you, but I think a lot of times companies are already coming to the table with, I'll say, low-hanging fruit or even fruit on the ground, and saying, yeah, we know that we need a new distribution center, and we know that it needs to be in Czech Republic, and it's either between city A or city B. And the reality is, it's not going to move the needle too much, whether it's city A or city B, but let us run some analytics just to see. I think the danger here, Martin, is that a lot of people go in way too deep for that type of decision that's not going to move the needle that much. And as a result of that, it actually prolongs the decision-making process. I don't know if you have this phrase, you'll have to give me the German for it, but we would say like analysis paralysis sometimes. And I think there's a lot of there's a saying that nobody gets fired for buying IBM. This is an old saying, like IBM is tried and true. You don't get fired for it, but you could get fired for putting a distribution center in the wrong place, right? Yeah. So I think the thing is, people want to feel very confident that they're making the right decision. But in my mind, they go a little bit too far. Oh, what is the exact labor rate in this city versus that city? And in reality, there's many, many other factors that are going to move the needle more in one direction. And what happens is you take so long with these projects that actually the beneficial window of doing it earlier has passed you by. If you look at like typical ROI analysis and you say there's a delay in the project by 25%, the net present value decreases so dramatically. So we have to keep that in check and make sure that we're doing the analysis in an appropriate time frame. And that will always tie back to the level of detail. What level of detail do we really need to make a decision?
Yeah, very good. Very short advertisement break. My new card deck, Kannst du Lieferkette, is out. It's completely in German, and it's 225 questions, end-to-end supply chain, so logistics, planning, production, warehousing. And I would love if you have a look at it. Only available in my own personal store, Supply Chain College online shop, store.deine-lieferkette.de. Thanks for having a look. Danke fürs Reinschauen. Und nun weiter im Video. Let's continue the video. I was also thinking, while you gave your answer on mature versus more innovative or companies which don't have this whatever, which are not a whole century old or whatever, because like on the one hand, I'm very happy that I have worked at big multinational companies who have a very long, let's say, or who have a very old or long history, whatever the right English is now. But also that makes it difficult because like all the footprint projects I run across on network design models is often a negative motivation. Let's say restructuring programs followed out of that. Whatever, when in my Unilever times, whatever, they had at a certain moment around 100 factories, whatever, plus minus. I'm not allowed to disclose all the details. But and then going down, whatever, 20% less or 25% less factories over a certain, whatever, short amount of years. So this is actually modeling in mature organizations usually results in a restructuring. If you are like on an innovation business unit or company which is very, very new, and you need to build something new because when you go into new markets, etc., I think also the complexity or the type or the beast of project may be very different, right? Do you have some experience on both ends?
It's really nice way to frame it. I think in the most mature organizations, whether they're old organizations or not, in the most mature organizations, you'll even find that they've resourced a supply chain design center of excellence, where they might have anywhere from 5 to 50 personnel working in this department, either building models or collecting the data or scoping the project. And that's because they are forward thinking, so they have a pipeline of projects. And because they have a pipeline of projects, they feel more comfortable investing in a pool of resources that they're not going to run out of work. And again, the projects might cover both things. It might be, well, we need to consider decommissioning some plants in this region, but we're also expanding into this other region. That might be another project, or we're making an acquisition. The business model is dynamic. The environment is dynamic. So it can come on both sides. Call it a closing down shop or opening up new shops. I think, like, as an example, there are a few companies that were already moving towards regionalized supply chains. And okay, we don't need to look much beyond the week's news from this week. We're recording this on March 5th of 2025. And just this week, Donald Trump has imposed 25% tariffs on US and Canada. That's within the region. And he's increased the tariffs on China, but that's outside of the region. So these companies were forward thinking. They invested before they actually needed to make a decision, and actually several years before they had to make a decision, because the project isn't done when you finish the analytics. It's still a PowerPoint slide or an Excel file, right? But then to implement those changes takes some time. So there's definitely some benefit to having the wherewithal, the resources, the software to allow yourself to be more forward thinking. On the other end of the spectrum, we can go maybe sub Fortune 100, maybe even deeper into the Fortune 1000, if we want to call it that. And certainly they have supply chains. Those supply chains need to change from time to time. Maybe they're not as complex as the Fortune 100 that we talked about, with multiple business units and thousands of product lines. But they still need to design their supply chains. It might even be more important, because they need to increase their margins, conserve their cash. And in that case, the only thing is that maybe they don't have a pipeline of projects. So instead of making the investment in software or full-time personnel, they will probably outsource it to consultants or have some staff augmentation and have somebody who's more in an analyst role or other manager role come in and drive that initiative forward hand in hand with consultants. So again, it comes to the size of the company. Being bigger generally allows you to be more forward thinking in this case.
Yeah. And that leads also a bit to one of the points I wanted to really discuss with you is, let's say, outsourcing, having in-house capabilities, but also maybe before we go there, touching quickly on the tools, because you mentioned digital twin already. And like there's this, like a lot of more on a really top management or executive level, a lot of people, let's call it, have this dream that we always have an up-to-date digital twin available for our whatever logistics footprint, manufacturing footprint, whatever. And then we can always zoom in and whatever, make a decision, on something. And I have actually not seen that, unfortunately, in my career. So usually when these questions come, then everybody is getting nervous and we are running around for days and weeks, hiring maybe external people, or if we're lucky, we have certain people in-house with a bit of capability, and we build something new, or we refresh it. If we have a tool, for instance, we need to refresh it because it has been 2 years outdated, because keeping it live is an enormous kind of effort.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible. Maybe the new technologies, maybe if you have some ideas on that, you can maybe also connect to that. Maybe with the whatever AI and whatever new capabilities will arise in the future. But how do you see that from a practical point of view, right? Do you know companies, maybe former customers, you don't need to disclose them, obviously, who have had this kind of always available, up-to-date, decision-ready, let's say, data set in a certain model? Or is that really like a dream and not reality today?
I think for almost okay, I've worked with quite a few mature companies, and it's been a while since I've been in this realm in particular, but call it 5 or 7 years ago. I think that there's still very few companies that have this utopia or dream model of a digital twin that you're describing. They may have it for specific regions. So I've worked with a very large food and beverage manufacturer that had different zones, and they had really, really built out their modeling competency. They hired the best people for these roles, and they really had a very clear mandate that you are going through these cycles every year where you're updating the analytics. So in that case, at least you knew you were getting a fresh model every year for this specific region. But I would also say that if somebody dropped in the need for some very specific analysis within this region, it could be that, yeah, but I still need to spin up some data for this specific analysis. I don't have the process speeds on these machines, or I don't have the transportation rates on the new lanes that you're talking about. So in practice, it's very difficult, and part of it is because it's hard to anticipate what the questions are going to be asked. Yeah, we can have a formal cycle where we use the models for capital budgeting and expansion and things like that. But if you came to me and said that, oh, this supplier is going out of business and we think we should acquire them, but it creates all these new transportation lanes, it creates new assets. Well, I need the data. And yesterday they were my supplier. So it's not like I had that data readily available to me. Now, you can start to make assumptions, but I would say that you're probably not making assumptions without the need to make assumptions. So the practice of having a living model will always be just off on the horizon a little bit. But I still think it's a worthy goal to strive for. Martin, I think it's also important to just, we think about it, it's impossible to separate this from a technology lens. And I think it's useful to start to break it down into building blocks of what the technology actually is. It's not going to surprise any one of your listeners that this type of analysis is fueled by data, right? We've already been talking about it. How do I get my arms around the data? So the first thing is data, but you need somewhere to put the data. That would be the next thing. So if you're going to be running analytics, you need some sort of standard schema. So you need a database with certain types of tables and fields. Just the classical examples. I'm doing a supply chain analysis. I need sites. I need products. I need manufacturing capabilities. And from there, it gets more and more complex. I need certain types of costs, certain process speeds, certain transit times. So these are the types of data elements that we think about. So we need data, and we need a database and a data schema to house that. And then usually we're applying some pretty sophisticated analytics techniques on top of this. So we talked briefly already about optimization and simulation, and there's other technologies as well. But then we need to apply those technologies and algorithms to our data that's in that nice structured database. And then I think the last building block is really, I'll generically call it a user interface, but most of us aren't taking the data directly out of Python script and just sending that to our executive management team, right? That's not what we do. We need to make maps, we need to make charts. So having a user interface for visualization and also for managing the data, running different sensitivity analyses and things like that, that's kind of the fourth building block, if you will. And these building blocks don't have to come in packaged off-the-shelf commercial software. I mean, depending on the scope and scale of the model, you might say Excel is fine for a data schema, right? I can have worksheets with different tables. You might say, I'm going to use Python and call an optimization package like Pulp or something like that. Or you might say, hey, I want commercial off-the-shelf software. That's what's right for my organization. And there's pros and cons if we want to get into that too, of having each of these things. And again, it will depend on the resources you have at your disposal, the capabilities of your personnel, and what you want to do ultimately with supply chain network design.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very very nice framework how you put it together. I actually would love to spend a bit of time on that. So let's stay maybe there, because like again I'm making it too simple again. But when I think about, like, let's say I'm in charge of supply chain and I need to run a network study, then what I have in mind there are kind of three routes and maybe a mix of them as a fourth one. So there is either I have an in-house team or I want to build an in-house team. I have maybe a software provider and a consultancy, or the software provider actually is offering also some consultancy service on top of selling the software, let's say. When I think about the in-house capabilities, let's say we are not a super huge multinational Fortune 100 you mentioned, etc. company. What I have seen, it's just my opinion based on my experience. Often you put very talented young supply chain professionals into these roles, but they will move on very fast, especially once such a project is successful, goes from analysis phase, let's say, into real implementation. So we will build that factory, we will shut that factory, we will build that warehouse or whatever. Then they move on, with the program. So you always lose the capability you just built actually for the project. That's what I have seen, because again, it's usually super smart, talented people in these teams, and then they're not staying there for 5 or 8 years or so in the same role. Also, I have seen working with consultants who sort of, they even, depending a bit on my position I had in the past, but I didn't even know what kind of tools they used. Did they have their in-house tool, like, or a Python, whatever, or a self-built tool? Did they work with a big provider like Lamasoft, you mentioned before, or Coupa now, or whatever, Supply Chain Guru, and these kind of things? I heard a lot of these programs before. But the funny thing is that, I'm not sure if it's funny, but I find it quite funny that sometimes when we dig out 4 or 5 years later, one of these studies, like the big PowerPoint deck also we got, let's say, and then you rerun it because you maybe you're surprised often it's not that different, the outcome. Because maybe if you're not that innovative and your customers don't change all the time, your footprint geographically, let's say, I mean, with footprint now didn't change so dramatically, why do we expect then a super duper different result? So that's also interesting. So we spend money on these every couple of years kind of projects, but actually the results are the same. But the interesting thing is the company never really spent the money to really do something about, because it's maybe a too big investment, too long payback or whatever. Based on your Llama, depending on how much you can talk about it, based on your Lamasoft part, have you just been a software provider, or actually we really also offered the consultancy services on top of that? So you had both sides, let's say, in such projects covered.
I would say this is true, by the way, just a nice way to think about it from software in particular. Most software companies are going to have consultancies associated with them. But I would say that it's a necessary evil. Why do I say it that way? Yeah, because if you think about the marginal cost on producing and selling software, it's very small, but there's an ongoing cost with consultancy. But we live in this world today where software is as a subscription, so we have to ensure that the customers are getting the value out of the software. And a lot of times the customers don't have the maturity to maximize the value out of the software. So we tend to have software vendors that have consultancies associated with them. That does not mean that the consultancies are deficient in any way. I would say that at my experience at Lamasoft, these were some of the smartest people that I've ever worked with, really, really rock stars. And by the way, I'll get myself in trouble, but probably they were the ones that were training the Deloittes and the Accentures and the Bains and BCGs of the world how to think about supply chain design. So it wasn't just about what buttons to push on the software; it was far beyond that. But I would say that if it wasn't required to keep the customer happy and successful, then the software vendors would typically not take on the role of also having consultancies for them, and they would be more profitable and have a better margin because of that. this is getting a little bit farther away from your question, so let me try to bring it back in. But when you were asking about maybe whether to insource it or outsource it, if that is the true essence of your question, I think that the reality is on any individual project that there should be a positive return on investment. Again, I just go back to that example. If we're talking about building a multi-million-dollar warehouse or distribution center or factory, and we must have some reason to believe that this is going to unlock some value in the marketplace. And to put a couple $100,000 of software and consultants on top of that is a drop in the bucket, so to speak. So I think it's very easy if people want to make the case to bring in consultants and specialized software for a project. It shouldn't be too hard to make the business justification for that. I think it depends on how many of these projects and the frequency. So what does your pipeline look like? So again, this is where it becomes big company versus small company. If you're a big company and you're constantly expanding into new business areas or new geographic areas, or considering acquisitions or divestitures, things like this, then you probably have a pipeline of 4, 5, 20 projects from across your business. And so you feel more comfortable making an investment in software and personnel to support that. Whereas again, if you're a company that's more reactive, then you probably don't want to make that investment in, call it permanent assets like software or personnel. And then it will be better to bring in a consultant. Now, the thing is, you definitely want to pair that consultant with people that are knowledgeable about the business, and even to the extent that if you can, knowledgeable about the analytics techniques as well, because yeah, the consultant won't know everything about your business, and it's important to challenge them. I say this as a consultant.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I think one of the downsides on these big network models, especially when you model like a whole, whatever, manufacturing or logistics footprint, there are high expectations, which sometimes don't help, because like top management of the company, they think we have too many warehouses, too many production lines or whatever. And then it's difficult actually to really live up to the expectations in such projects when you come back with, because actually it hasn't been stupid whatever decades ago other professionals did, right, who were sitting in certain positions, etc. But it's more maybe anecdotal. But then one question actually which popped into my mind, because in this modeling we often model the end picture. Let's say, how can it look like after the transition, right? So whatever, let's say we have X amount of warehouses and let's 50, and maybe the model says 40 would be enough, but they need to be placed differently on the globe. That's the end picture. But the transition can be, as we said before, multiple years or even longer than a decade. How do you model this transition phase? Is it even possible? Because that has a huge impact on the cost and the investment, and maybe interruption, also whatever, bad service levels, unhappy customers, people in the company are not fed up with all the changes all the time, because things break all the time.
It's absolutely,
does that work well?
I would say it's absolutely possible. So you're correct that a lot of companies focus on, we would call it, I will avoid getting too technical here, but say a single period model, meaning, okay, it's 1 year and that year is out in the future somewhere. But it is absolutely possible to build a multi-period model. I use the word period because the periods could be years. They could be years up to a certain point, and then you start looking at 2 or 3 years at a time, something like that. So you can right size the periods to whatever you want, and they don't even always have to be even, right? But let's just say that you're looking at an end state that's 10 years out, just to keep it simple. And I have every year in yearly buckets leading up to this. You can run a model that says, based on the demand for each year, if that's the big variable, this is what DCs I should open or close in every year. And of course, you don't want a DC to open 1 year, close the next year, open the next year. So you can put in constraints that say, once the DC opens or closes, don't change it again after that. And then you have a nice transition plan or a glide path that says, this is what every year or even every quarter should look like moving to this end state. Now, if your end state is still 10 years away, you probably also want to refresh this model periodically as well with, again, I use demand as the main variable here, but it could be your transport prices, or it could be some external variable, again, like tariffs or something like that. So it is absolutely possible to model like a 10-year horizon in annual buckets and to create a transition plan. And then people can back off of that transition plan and say, if we're going to open or close this warehouse in year 8, then in year 4, we need to start thinking about personnel and construction costs, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. But it already sounds super complex, right? Because we have this multi-period, but also we have multi-scenario. You mentioned a lot optimization and simulation, right? And how to decide how many scenarios to look into, because that can be never ending.
Yeah, it's
the anecdote to it.
Martin, I love if it's a question, I love it. Like, first of all, I think actually if we reframe the entire conversation, I would never say that there's like a single deliverable at the end of these projects. I think it is a discovery process, and we should really look at it that way. This is a tool, a discovery process, and if you're building it in-house, it's an organizational muscle that you need to develop as well. Because you're absolutely right. You're gonna say, wait, why did it do this? And what if this happens? And every question will lead to 5 other questions as well. So in the end, your project is never done. And then, by the way, things change. I keep saying it, but like this week, there are probably a lot of companies that should just throw out their annual forecast because of the tariff situation. So there are a lot of things that change. So it needs to be, if you really want to use this properly, a discovery process, a tool for discovery and generating conversations. And if that's the case, it needs to be an organizational muscle that you're developing, either in-house or with the help of some long-term partner. And you make me think about another thing as well. I would never want to go into an executive meeting and present a single result and say, this is the supply chain you need, right? What we know supply chain is about trade-offs. We can talk about that all day if you want. But I really like the concept of trade-off curves or presenting multiple scenarios and letting the stakeholders who are making the decision not just see a singular answer or even just 1 or 2 answers, but what is this trade-off curve, and what is your appetite of service versus cost, or risk versus cost, capital investment, inventory versus service, all types of trade-offs that we can have in multiple dimensions. And it seems like I'm saying, yeah, I'm putting the burden back on the decision maker. Hey, I did not give you a single answer, or maybe even not a recommendation, but I think it's really up to, like, what is our risk appetite? What are we trying to achieve with service? Are we trying to beat our competitors? Is faster always better? To what extent is that true? So I would rather present a spectrum of options and say, dear stakeholders, where do you land on this graph? And then I would step out and watch them debate amongst themselves, because there is absolutely a subjective and human element to this that as of today, the analytics cannot answer.
Yeah, very good. I loved the discovery process, the term. So I noted also down to use it also in some similar projects, maybe at my
because every question will lead to 5 other questions. So you maybe we would say a cop out, like, I'm not going to give you a single deliverable, but really this is how I feel about it. It's a tool, right? It's a tool.
Yeah, and also maybe coming back to the risk management part, because you mentioned tariffs now twice already. What are typical risks you would love to simulate or you have based on a practical experience, the risks you were happy actually that you simulated them, because some of them materialized and then we had a kind of a plan B in the drawer?
Yeah, I think in practicality, there are lots of different types of risks. You could even look at demand as a risk, right? On both sides of the equation, you might say demand is not going to materialize the way that we expected it to. So what happens when we don't have enough volume going through this factory to sustain it? On the other hand, what happens if the demand skyrockets and we don't have enough capacity to meet demand? Those are risks. What if fuel prices change dramatically? That's a risk. What about tariffs? So there's many types of risks, but I think if we think about it deeply, it's not so many what are the individual events that might be risks, but what there's a broad spectrum of risks or things that can occur, but they tend to have a smaller handful of effects. I would give the example, like I think about what happened when the Evergreen was wedged sideways in the Suez Canal, right? And you could not have predicted that a day beforehand, right? And all of a sudden, global traffic, marine traffic, had to reroute around the Suez Canal. What are the impacts? Lead time, shortages on inventory, raw materials, and finished goods. So prices go up, service issues, things like this. And now we have the same thing. I'll focus on the same geographic region, but okay, we have Houthi rebels that are effectively slowing commerce through that area as well, and we're rerouting vessels, and we have the same effect. So two totally different events. One is I call it a maritime accident. The other is a geopolitical tension. But it could also be a natural phenomenon. We had a pandemic outbreak and in Egypt, and the Suez Canal is closing down. I'm giving some crazy example here, but it's not or an earthquake or something, and some other disruption to the area. So it's not so much the specific events, but the outcome of it. And Martin, here's where I would take it a step away from analytics, because again, we have to start to separate the different types of uncertainty, right? There's a uncertainty that we have a pretty good feeling that demand could be in this range or fuel prices could be in this range. But I think there's a lot of binary decisions and unknowns that we're just not expecting. Like earlier this week, we could have said, yeah, we don't know if the tariffs will actually go through or not. And by the way, even if they go through, we don't know if there'll be retaliatory tariffs or not. So we have to start to balance where we can predict and where we should prepare. And here I will reach back to my bookshelf one more time here, because this is a phenomenal book as well. So it's Strategic Planning for Dynamic Supply Chains, Planning for Uncertainty Using Scenarios. And some of the names are recognizable. So I think a lot of people know Yossi Sheffi, Chris Caplice, but also Shardul Fadnis. These are wonderful researchers and practitioners in the field. I read this book, and it's not necessarily quantitative analysis, but it's really thinking about these external macro forces that really can have a dramatic impact on our supply chain. And we might be sitting here, I'll say, moving the chairs on the Titanic, right? Is demand going to be 100 or 90 or 110? But then something like this comes along, like the tariffs or an earthquake or COVID. And we really need to be prepared and react to that. And I don't want it to be fear mongering, like that's not my intent here, but I actually just think it's the reality of our environment today. It's quite dynamic. And the companies that I see succeeding in supply chain are the ones who are forward thinking and thinking about how will the world change in the next couple of years? And even if I can't predict it quantitatively, how can I prepare for it? So I think on top of this supply chain network design and optimization and simulation, there's this more macro layer of what will the world look like in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, and how can we have plans for that?
Yeah, and what I also like to add, you mentioned that before, let's say not macro layer, not only macro layer, but also the strategic layer. Because what I see often wrong when we do the supply chain modeling, it's often cost driven. Let's say get the best cost profile out of the manufacturing or logistics footprint. But connecting supply chain to strategy, like what service levels do we want to have in certain regions? Order lead times, these kind of things. Yeah, which kind of portfolio do we really want to offer or not offer, etc. That is also sometimes forgotten to ask. Or again, supply chain folks do it in isolation without actually, and that could be maybe the scenarios to plan, to challenge the sales, marketing, let's say the commercial side of the company, and say, okay, what if we do this and that differently? What would be the impact to the footprint, irrespective if costs go up or down? But what do we win or lose? Yeah.
Martin, I wanted actually I mentioned earlier that I have an article that's going to be published, and this comes back to this. So I just showed this book, which is the scenario planning by these gentlemen from MIT, and then I'll take one of Bram's books here, the strategy driven supply chain. And I read these at about the same time. Maybe it's coincidence, but this is where I put these together. And I said, okay, This tells you what you need to do, but this tells you what might happen or how to think about what might happen. And so Bram and I have been teaching this workshop, and it starts with market outlook analysis. So we start thinking about what are the macro forces that matter to my business? What are the local factors as well? It's not always just about these macro things. You could have very localized changes happening as well with certain migration patterns, demographics, things like that. So we start cataloging those, and then those feed into a scenario generation tool. It's just an Excel scoring matrix. But as a result of that, we generate multiple worldviews, right? And they're structurally diverse, right? And from the scenarios, we'll say, okay, how is your customer landscape changing in these scenarios? If your demographic is changing, it might impact your assortment, as you mentioned. What types of complexity and variability might we encounter? So is it going to be a highly regulated environment? Is it going to be low cost capital, right? Free money, things like that. These are things that matter as well. What will our competition be like in this scenario? And from there, that's where in these workshops, we actually have a cross-functional representation. So it's not just supply chain people. We have commercial people, we have financial people, all divisions of the organization. And we don't just jump from scenario planning into supply chain network design. We actually go from scenario planning into strategic value proposition design. And this is not my area of expertise, but Bram, I'll take credit for connecting supply chain and finance in my own head. Bram was the one that brought to life connecting supply chain to strategy and value proposition through his research. And so here he delivers this workshop session, and we start to think about if your customers and competitors are such and such in this scenario, what your value drivers and value proposition need to be. Is it having a broader assortment? Is it a low cost proposition? Is it a high service, high touch proposition? Think about things like home delivery and things like that. The list is endless, right? And we engage the commercial people as well as the supply chain people. And once we establish what that value proposition looks like in that scenario, then we can take it to supply chain design and say, okay, what KPIs or key performance indicators does that value proposition translate to? Is it, we look at it along multiple categories: customer, financial, also we call it general welfare, but social and ecological things as well. So we translate those value drivers into KPIs. And if you're familiar with supply chain optimization, we think about, or optimization in general, we think about the objective function, we think about constraints, and we think about decision variables. And in these workshops, it's mostly executives. We're not going to take them into the mathematics of optimization, but we can do this in a qualitative manner. And we can say, your value drivers now translate to your objective function. You're trying to maximize revenue and deliver on this service level, for instance. And you also have these constraints coming out of the scenario. Again, I give the example of a highly regulated environment, or an environment where people say, this is not socially acceptable, we can't source from this country anymore, we need to source locally, something like this. And we can also think about our competitors as well. And so we have objectives and we have constraints. Now we need to think about our decision variables. What's eligible for change in this scenario? And there could be, the list could be endless depending on what industry you're in and things like that. But it forces us outside of the box thinking. And we don't, again, at this stage, have them do quantitative analysis on designing the supply chain, but we then take it to what we would call the triple bottom line impact. Triple bottom line being people, profit, planet. And yeah, there's a lot focused on profit, but we also want to bring in those other elements as well. And here we have them say, okay, what types of investments would I need to make? Both capital investments, but also personnel and certain capabilities in my organization, IT systems, plant, property, and equipment. What would that cost? And at this stage, it's usually back of envelope, right? We don't give them a lot of time to dig into this, but you walk away with a list of the investments. This is what it would cost, and you can make a rough business justification for it. In some cases, it's not feasible, right? Like we need to go back to the drawing board. But this is where it becomes fun, because maybe we have multiple teams and we have 4 scenarios, and we can look across these scenarios and say, these investments are robust across all of these scenarios. No matter what your world will be like in 5 years, this is worthwhile investing. It'll never be a waste. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have some that we would say these are contingent. You only need to make this investment if this world or this reality is coming true. And if you're going to do that, let's go back to your macro forces and let's think about the market indicators, whether it be GDP or something like this, that would indicate in advance that this is coming to reality. So it's this end-to-end spectrum where we take them all the way from market outlook analysis, scenario planning, value proposition, supply chain design, and then we evaluate the impact of it.
Very nice. That's very comprehensive, and that's like a perfect summary actually. That could be a 5 minutes video
we
alone,
can come back
just
and
a summary.
talk about
So
that
I will
one.
definitely
Yeah.
that's definitely something to publish separately also on LinkedIn. And I wanted to come a bit to the pitfalls, but actually I think you ticked a lot of boxes now in your summary, the last one, because I think what I hear also actually not connecting macro strategy to the modeling, etc., then that's maybe a pitfall. We talked a bit about the different time horizons at the very, very beginning, like, because I had a very simple question. Is it a good idea to disconnect manufacturing from logistics footprint? Because I've seen that here and there in my career. And I was always thinking, but let's say they need to be in sync. You cannot just, let's say, have let's say either everything is a variable or not, right? Because
Right.
like often I have been in like whatever, this warehouse or this plant is untouchable. That must remain in place for whatever reason. That's not go there. But
Sacred cow is what we call it, right? Yeah.
exactly, and but that may completely disturb the outcome of the model. Do you have anything else? It can be also tiny things, pitfalls you have seen, like really things which made projects fail. Let's say, if I'm very, very radical in formulating it.
I will say that just to build on your example, it is definitely possible to have manufacturing and distribution in the same model. Those don't necessarily need to be separated, but again, depending on the fidelity of your model, if you're modeling resources on the manufacturing floor and the warehouse floor, this can become quite a complex and detailed model. So in my experience, I just share one example of what to do and what not to do. In these cases, I have experienced times when a company is working on both distribution and manufacturing. They know they need to make changes in both functions. And in one case, this is the example, what not to do. The company actually called upon Lamasoft, and it was 2 phone calls. One was from manufacturing that said, can you help us do this model? And one was from distribution. And the distribution guy said, we think manufacturing is going to do this, so help us build a model to prepare for it. And okay, we'll take your money, but you really should be talking to one another, right? And then coming to us. And maybe it cannot be done in one model, and that's okay, but at least we're working in concert together. An example of where that went right, I gave an example earlier of a pretty sophisticated food and beverage manufacturer, and they were working in zones. And in the zones, they had models for both manufacturing plants and distribution, but they had a very synchronized process. And for them, the manufacturing was the heavy CapEx. That was the focus of their modeling. So they would run a model for manufacturing, and then they would feed the results of that into distribution, and they would consider the distribution secondary, but there were times when they needed to take that as a feedback loop and feed it back into manufacturing. They had it down to a science that I won't go into here, but the main thing was that it was working in concert together through some methodology instead of completely separating and coming with two separate models that weren't talking to each other. So yeah, there's a right way to do it. But yeah, I always think that the first pitfall is, I use the phrase, unlike in America, we say, you're innocent until proven guilty. When you're doing supply chain network modeling, I try to keep the guard up and say, you're guilty until proven innocent. So let's understand why you want to bring that complexity into the model. Because the reality is, Martin, sometimes you can put together a good model in an Excel spreadsheet in just a matter of days if you make some assumptions. Yeah, it's the same cost per kilometer of transportation everywhere, the same labor rate everywhere. Even this in a matter of days can give you some good directional indicator. And then you say, okay, we need to come with more detail. We need to do it by product line. We need to do it by different geographies. Now we can start to admit some of that complexity, but you need to meter it and let it in slowly, because it's a lot easier to add complexity to a simple model than to take complexity out of an already sophisticated model.
Yeah, very good. Then, is there anything else you were thinking about in preparation of our talk today? You wanted to share on the topic of supply chain network design?
It might be a little bit broader than that, Martin, but maybe just as closing thoughts, I think where I work at Washington University, they call me a professor of practice. Okay, and I think that's kind of funny, but there's something appealing to academia about bringing experts. And by the way, I put experts in quotes for those that are just listening, about bringing experts from industry into academia. And I think it's valuable, right? We want to bridge the gap between academia and industry, bring some real world experience. I'm not dismissing that at all. I think it's an excellent objective. But I would also say that there needs to be a stronger need, a stronger focus on bringing theory and concepts from
Mhm.
academia into practice as well. You have no idea how many practitioners I talk to that say, well, the safety stock formula won't work for us, or the EOQ formula won't work for us. And they throw up their hands and say, yeah, but it's just theory. We do something
Mhm.
different here. And then you ask them what they are doing different, and you don't want to know the answer sometimes. So I think there's a lot of smart people in supply chain, but I also think that there need to be a lot more smart people in supply chain. And that's what keeps me going on a day-to-day basis.
Very nice. I can only underline it or underwrite it, what you said. Very nice. Um, Then I really need to make you a compliment. I really loved the discussion with you. I was a bit concerned when I approached you on the, not because of you, but more the topic, supply chain network design. That can be really boring, but you didn't make it boring. It was you. We jumped whatever from strategic level to operational level, combining it with all kind of wisdom and expertise. I really really liked it. I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope also the listeners, viewers, will do the same if they manage to come to that point in the conversation. Yeah, then thanks a lot. I really appreciate it sharing everything you know with me and also with everybody else who will consume the content. And I would love to have you back at the Supply Chain College, especially when you published your framework, let's say, what you touched upon or mentioned at least. Yeah, thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate you.
Martin, it's kudos to you. Thanks for facilitating the conversation with wonderful questions, and very pleased that you could have me and happy to come back anytime. So thank you.